In the previous video I talked a bit about Debussy's Clair de Lune. In this one we take on another famous piano work from him, the first Arabesque. Yay! The word Arabesque means a form of artistic decoration based on patterns. And that's exactly what this piece is all about. Beautifully crafted melody lines intertwining and unraveling, embedded in a solid comprehensible ternary structure. This is also the reason I will speak a little bit less about harmonic progressions and instead put more emphasis on melody, form, rhythm, and the development and characteristics of these ideas. As usual, we'll first listen to the recording and then follow along the score with the analysis. Again, I want to thank EMSLP and Muse Open. I forgot and couldn't find who did the recording, but another thank you to that person. Also, if you appreciate the content, don't forget to leave a like or subscribe, or even support me on Patreon. Before we look on a microscale what happens, take before you the sheet music and look at the entire structure of the piece. For this one, it's quite obvious, a ternary or the so-called ABA form. A structure that Debussy uses a lot, also a very straightforward and a strong structure that anyone can appreciate and understand. The visual hints on the sheet music, such as the key changes and the double bar lines, make this clear. Always look at the big structure first before you want to analyze deeper. Let's start with section A. The key is E major, but Debussy doesn't start on a tonic. Instead, he uses a parallel chord progression that starts with the subdominant. The basic structure is just an up and downward arpeggio. The consequence of using no melody or any other voice, and the fact that there is no strong cadence, has as a consequence that we don't feel at the beginning of a piece. For me, this feels like a transition into something that will come. And thus I don't label a theme yet, just this basic structure that of course will be a motive for the whole piece. What comes next is another motive, 3 simple notes on top of more arpeggios, easy to recognize. Very important here is the second beat. Let me explain this. During the entirety of this work, the emphasis of almost every melody will be on the second beat. For me, this is like the hidden motive. It's not a melody or chord or specific rhythm, just the second beat that toys with your notion of rhythm. The 3-note motive is used again, but in a more upward motion to create some tension to end the introduction transition. Then comes a 2-5-1 cadence to start the first theme. The first theme is a downward quick motion of the E major pentatonic scale. The triplets that were used in the bass are transferred to this theme, while the accompaniment bass in blue shifts from triplets to 8 notes. We get a nice figuring 4/6 polyrhythm. A truly decorative arabesque, if you ask me. To make this rhythm shift a bit more pleasant and logical, Debussy slows down the tempo just before the theme kicks in. Here are some highlighted emphasis on the second beat to illustrate the hidden theme. The material is repeated and then extends into a longer upward moving phrase with the accent still on the second beat. This phrase works well because of the motivic connections. When you're composing yourself, this is a great way to learn how to build phrases. Just keep recycling material and transform it into what feels natural to you. I'm not saying this is the way, but it's certainly something that I do in composing. If you're not interested in this, it could still be an exercise of some sort. Anyway, as I said, the phrase continues into a sequence and starts to move higher in a secondary dominant. The motivic connection is still there, now with the triplet motive inverted. Also notice the shift in the bass accompaniment. Debussy changes the bass figuring to halftime in a series of 4 upward 8 notes that continuously move higher. This is to support the rising climactic melodic line. On the last 2 measures we reach a high point that lingers. However, in the next measure, Debussy deceives us and evades the resolution. He brings back the introductory transition progression. This time, the meandering arpeggios are supported by a subtle falling melody. The chord progression is the same as in the introduction, but what comes next is new material. The melody will develop into a long downward moving sequence on more remote chords. The accents on the second beat disappear for a while, but not completely. The sequence eventually briefly modulates weakly into A major. The melody goes into a very low register. In my opinion, there is a more tranquil feeling here. The flow even stops completely with the recurring of the first motive from measure 3. The tonic transforms into the secondary dominant of the subdominant. From this low point on, Debussy will start another line that will continue to move upward. Scale degree 2 of A major, namely B minor, is transformed into the B dominant 7th chord of E major. The motive is used in a sequence that moves upward. I would count the last green box also as the same motive. The rhythm is preserved, but the melody is transformed to steps of parallel thirds. Also notice the variety in the bass, 8 notes, rests and triplets, arpeggios, etc. This creates a bit of discontinuity, a feeling of searching for something to hold on to. And Debussy will deliver this in the first climax. He uses the triplet stepwise movement from the previous slide to create a long upward melodic line on the dominant 7th chord. It resolves on the tonic with a beautiful 9/8 suspension. F sharp moves to E. This is the second highest note in the composition. With that, the first section closes. The note E is used for a common tone modulation to A major. E major becomes the dominant of A major. A major will be the main key for the middle section now. If we look at the macro scale, the landscape of notes has changed quite much. Debussy now writes in blocked chords reminiscent of a Bach chorale. But the harmony is very weak though, with almost no cadences. The melody here is what I would call the second theme. It consists of the first two measures that uses our triplet motive again, with emphasis on the second beat. Measure 3 and 4 represent a rising sequence. The melody is repeated and this time it gets a solution into a half cadence or a short modulation into E major if you like. The chorale style is suddenly interrupted by ideas from part A, the tempo is sped up as well. The arpeggio goes into a sequence that gets a climax on a cadence in A major. This material has the same rhythmic pattern as the second theme. The motive here is used in a sequential idea to bring down the momentum. The sudden burst appears again. The climax is now extended 2 times with that same rhythmic pattern. Notice how Debussy brings the bass a bit higher on the same chord to create more tension and longing. Again we are deceived and Debussy brings back the second theme. The second theme is repeated and ends in a half cadence or a cadence in E major, just as before. Then a big twist. The melody and chords are more condensed and simple, but the harmony is changed to the remote key of C major. Still the triplet motive is present to keep it together. Notice the beautiful opposing symmetrical movement of lines, as well as the symmetry in the chord progression. Debussy repeats the triplet motive in a higher register. The line starts to become even more condensed by the use of long half notes. This right here is just a little mistake on the score. This needs to be a quarter note instead of an 8th note. The motive is repeated again before transforming chromatically into the home key of E major. I find this modulation also to be very sudden and piercing, but there is no other way to get back to E major. The double bar line indicates the ending of the B section. Debussy brings back the introduction arpeggios that will form a transition into our first theme on the next slide. This is all a repetition to contrast the B section, also the next 2 slides. The transition material is repeated, the harmony stays the same, but Debussy plays with the rhythm in the melody by using a lot of syncopations. Yet the key points of the melody stay the same: A, G sharp, F sharp and E. Then the material is used for a brief sequential modulation into A major. E major comes back via classical common chord pivot modulation. The green motive is used to keep everything together here. Another surprise is that Debussy cuts the melody in a half measure, just before the mini cadenza. This part is reminiscent of back in the days where solo cadenza and concerti were very common, just before the beginning of the coda. We can thus view this part as the final transition into the last section, namely the coda. The harmony is a fully fledged cadence with a nice 6/5 suspension, in which G sharp resolves to F sharp, the 5th of the dominant B7 chord. The cadence is completed on the tonic where the coda starts with the last repetitions of the first theme, first in a high register, later in the usual one. The final climax looks a bit like the one just before the B section. This right here is the highest note in the composition. Before listening to the piece again, I want to give some summarizing advice on how to approach works like these for analysis. First of all, when you print out the score, look at its entirety. Look at the pages and how they look different from each other. This can already give a good hint on the structure. Look at the tempos, dynamics, other indications such as key changes and double bar lines, etc. Secondly, macro before micro. First understand the big structure before analyzing the details. Thirdly, use harmony as a guideline. When you have the harmonic analysis in place, things will be more structured in your head. Contrasts will be more clear as well as the purpose of different sections. Number 4, look for highest and lowest notes. Number 5, look for the golden ratio. Often key moments in compositions will happen according to the golden ratio time-wise. And lastly, but most importantly, listen and enjoy. Ask yourself questions. What do I feel about a particular section? Is it logical that a section A ends here and a section B starts here? And why? Or for example, does this passage feel like something new? Does it feel like something is to come, or does it represent something independent? Your analyzing eyes on the score should not deceive your inner ear. You can also use this when composing. In certain occasions, I let my instinct, thus my ears, decide, while the rational thinking happens to correct and redirect my instinct when it's lost or wrong. Okay, so that's it. Thank you for watching and listening. Feel free to subscribe and or support me on Patreon, and hopefully see you next time.